Madeline Cooper had always imagined that her later years would be calmer, slower, and filled with small routines that felt safe and predictable. After her divorce, she moved into a modest single-story house on a quiet residential street at the edge of a small Oregon town. It was the kind of place where the air felt different after dark, heavy with the scent of pine and the dampness from the nearby river, and the silence was so complete that you could hear the faint rustle of deer moving through the empty lot behind. Her yard. For the first time in years, she felt like she could finally breathe without the constant weight of other people's demands pressing on her. She kept her home in order, planted a small vegetable garden, and took comfort in the fact that nights here had a darkness she had long missed. An unbroken black sky pierced only by the pale spill of moonlight. That darkness was part of her sense of safety. When the day ended, she could close her curtains, leave her bedroom window cracked for fresh air, and drift into sleep to the faint chorus of crickets. That sense of peace ended abruptly on a Tuesday night in early spring, when she woke at 2 a.m. with her heart pounding and her eyes struggling to adjust to an unfamiliar brightness. It wasn't the kind of glow you got from a passing car or a neighbor's porch light. It was sharper, colder, a white glare that cut through her curtains and poured across her bed like a floodlight. Disoriented, she got up and pulled the curtains back, only to find that the streetlight across from her house, which had always thrown a gentle amber wash toward the intersection, was now pivoted directly at her bedroom window. The beam was harsh and sterile, the kind you'd expect to see in a parking lot or over a construction site, and it seemed almost deliberate in the way it centered on her home. She stood there for several minutes, her mind scrambling for an explanation. Maybe the wind had pushed it. Maybe the maintenance crew had been out earlier and adjusted it by mistake. But the stillness of the street, the lack of any recent work, and the odd angle of the fixture made those possibilities feel thin. It wasn't aimed down the road, it was aimed at her. She tried closing the curtains again, but the light bled through the fabric, flattening the shadows in her room until everything looked strangely two-dimensional. Even with her eyes closed, she could see the afterimage burning in her vision, a pale rectangle that made it impossible to relax. Lying back in bed, she felt her thoughts begin to turn over in that slow, uneasy way that hinted at something larger than a simple malfunction. This was not a street known for trouble, and her neighbors were generally quiet, though she'd noticed some of them watching her with that polite but slightly too long glance that meant they'd been talking. She told herself not to spiral into suspicion, yet a knot had already settled in her stomach. She didn't like the idea of being noticed here, not after working so hard to disappear into the background of her own life. The beam from the streetlight felt less like illumination and more like scrutiny, and by the time the first traces of dawn began to dissolve it, she already knew that whatever this was, it wasn't going to be something she could simply ignore. The following morning, Madeline's first thought upon waking was that the whole thing might seem less unsettling in daylight, that perhaps the sharp unease she had felt during the night would fade once the sun rose and she could see the streetlight in its ordinary context. Yet when she stepped outside, coffee mug warming her hands against the cool morning air, the sight waiting for her only deepened the sense that what had happened was not a simple matter of faulty equipment. The pole itself was unchanged, tall and nondescript, but the lamphead was unmistakably turned at an angle that did not match the others lining the street, its glass housing catching the pale sunlight in a way that made the tilt obvious even without the glare it had unleashed hours earlier. She stood at the edge of her driveway for a long moment, scanning the street for any sign of recent work. No fresh tire tracks, no ladders or cones left behind, no markings sprayed on the asphalt. What she did see, however, was Janet Walker, the woman who lived 2 houses down, standing on her front porch in a bright floral robe, speaking to a man in a reflective vest who was rolling up a length of cable. They were too far away for Madeline to hear clearly, but she caught fragments carried on the breeze. Better this way, can see everything, safer for everyone. At one point, Janet gestured vaguely in Madeline's direction without looking directly at her the way people do when they want to point something out without making it obvious they're doing so. The man in the vest gave a small nod, slung the coil of cable into the back of his truck, and drove off without a word, leaving Janet to linger on her porch with a faint, satisfied smile before disappearing inside. Madeline tried to tell herself she was reading too much into it, that perhaps Janet had been talking about something entirely unrelated, but the uneasy timing gnawed at her. She had only exchanged polite greetings with Janet since moving in, and while the woman's tone was always coated in neighborly cheer, there was something clipped and slightly performative about it, as if she were the self-appointed gatekeeper of the street's social order. It wouldn't be difficult to imagine her deciding that a bright, all-night flood of light was a form of protection the neighborhood needed, and once that image took hold in Madeline's mind, it refused to loosen its grip. Later that afternoon, she called the municipal lighting department to report what she thought was a misalignment. The woman on the other end was courteous enough but seemed distracted, tapping at her keyboard in between long silences. Eventually, she told Madeline that the light had been redirected per a request from residents on that street, and that it was classified as a safety adjustment. When Madeline asked who had made the request, the woman hesitated, then explained that she wasn't authorized to give out names, but confirmed that it was not an error and that the change had been approved by the local community liaison. She offered to file a counter-request to have it re-aimed, but cautioned that the process could take weeks, possibly months, depending on priority needs elsewhere. It was the casualness with which she said it that struck Madeline most, the implication that her sleep, her privacy, and the disruption of her home environment were matters of negligible urgency. She thanked the woman, hung up, and spent the next half-hour pacing her living room, the conversation replaying in her mind until it hardened into a certainty that this had been done deliberately and with the cooperation of at least one neighbor. By evening, the memory of the previous night's glare began to gnaw at her again. She found herself dreading the moment the sun dipped and the lamp would hum to life, flooding her bedroom with that intrusive light. When it did, she stood at her window watching it, not because she wanted to, but because she couldn't seem to turn away. She noticed something she had missed before. The beam wasn't static. Every so often the intensity shifted almost imperceptibly, a faint pulse of brightness before it settled again. It was subtle, but once seen, it became impossible to ignore, and it brought with it the disturbing realization that someone, somewhere, could be making adjustments in real time. Around midnight she thought she saw movement in the reflection on the lamp's housing, a shadow crossing the street, a figure passing quickly beneath it. She leaned closer to the glass, trying to catch a better look, but the glare made it impossible to distinguish anything clearly. The next morning, she found a cigarette butt crushed into the gravel near the base of her mailbox, something that had not been there the day before. It could have been left by anyone, she reasoned, yet combined with everything else, it carried the faint chill of a calling card, the kind that says, without words, that someone had been close enough to stand in her yard while she slept. The thought stayed with her through the day, seeping into even the most mundane tasks, until she caught herself checking the windows every few minutes, scanning for a glimpse of that bright, unblinking eye at the end of the street. What had begun as an inconvenience was shifting into something far stranger, and she could feel the balance tipping toward a conflict she had neither asked for nor fully understood, but could no longer pretend wasn't unfolding around her. By the third night, the light had taken on an almost sentient quality in Madeline's mind, not because she believed it was alive, but because its presence no longer felt passive. It had become a constant intrusion, a presence that followed her from room to room, finding her in the kitchen when she poured tea, in the hallway when she tried to distract herself with chores, and, most invasively, in her bedroom when she lay awake, pretending she might eventually fall asleep. Her body was already showing the strain. Her eyes felt gritty in the mornings, her thoughts fogged faster than they used to, and she caught herself forgetting small but important things, like whether she had locked the back door or fed the cat. On the fourth day, she decided to stop speculating about who was behind it and start creating a paper trail that could not be ignored, even if it meant putting herself in uncomfortable situations. She began by visiting the small administrative office downtown where residents filed lighting and road maintenance requests. The young man behind the desk, clearly not accustomed to people showing up in person, greeted her with an uneasy smile and an offer to check the system for her complaint. He scrolled through the file on his monitor and confirmed that the adjustment had been authorized after a petition from multiple residents, a detail that tightened the knot in her stomach. When she asked how many signatures there had been and whether she could view them, he hesitated, then mumbled something about privacy rules before offering her a printed confirmation of the authorization, complete with the date and the case number. It wasn't much, but it was more than she'd had before, and she took it without comment, slipping it into her bag as she left. Outside, the sky was low and gray, and the wind carried that damp edge that meant rain was coming. She walked the few blocks back to where her car was parked, noting absently that the same dark green SUV she'd noticed near her street 2 nights ago was idling at the corner. The driver's face was obscured by the angle and the reflection on the windshield, but the way the vehicle pulled away slowly as she reached her car was enough to make her skin prickle. She told herself it could have been coincidence, but the awareness of being observed was already sinking deeper into her mind. That night, she resisted the temptation to sit in the window and watch the lights switch on. Instead, she moved quietly through her house with most of the interior lights off, hoping to see the street outside without the interference of her own reflections. Around 11, she caught sight of movement again. This time, not just a flicker in the corner of her vision, but a distinct figure. A man walking slowly along the opposite sidewalk, stopping directly under the streetlight for a few seconds before continuing toward the intersection. He didn't look toward her house, but his posture was deliberate, as if he was there for a reason that had nothing to do with getting somewhere. The next morning, she found fresh footprints in the soft dirt by the hedge that bordered her driveway. They were deep enough to be recent, the kind made when the ground is still holding the weight of the night's moisture, and they curved in a way that suggested someone had stepped off the sidewalk, lingered for a moment, then stepped back. She photographed them with her phone, not because she thought the image would be decisive proof, but because it felt necessary to record every change, every sign of intrusion. She also made the decision to contact the local police's non-emergency line, explaining that she believed there had been repeated late-night presence near her property, possibly connected to the streetlight adjustment. The officer who took her call listened without interrupting, then told her to keep documenting anything unusual and to call immediately if she saw someone on her property. His tone wasn't dismissive, but it was clear he saw this as a low-priority matter unless something more concrete happened. By late afternoon, Janet appeared at her door without knocking, carrying a covered dish and smiling in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes. She claimed it was just a welcome gesture, and chatted breezily about how, these days you can't be too careful about keeping the neighborhood well lit, punctuating the remark with a pointed glance toward the front windows. Madeline kept her answers polite and brief, taking the dish but not inviting her inside. When Janet left, the air in the house felt heavier, as if her presence had lingered. That night, as Madeline tried to focus on reading, the light outside began its strange pulsing again, a slow, almost rhythmic fluctuation in brightness that drew her attention until she was certain it was intentional. This time, she noticed something she hadn't before. During each dim cycle, the shadows on her front wall shifted subtly, as though the beam were being adjusted from another angle entirely. She didn't yet understand how, but the sense that someone was using the light for more than illumination settled in with the weight of certainty. She went to bed knowing that whatever this was, it was no longer just about inconvenience or even harassment. It was about control, and it was escalating. The rain had started in the early hours of the morning, a steady, soaking kind of rain that clung to the town all day and made the streets gleam under the dim light of the overcast sky. Madeline spent most of it indoors, not because she wanted to hide, but because she was trying to think through her next step with a clarity she knew she wouldn't have if she allowed herself to act on frustration alone. The conversation with the municipal office, the strange SUV, the footprints near her hedge, and Janet's pointed remarks had all braided themselves into a single rope of unease that pulled tighter with each passing day. She had no intention of becoming the kind of person who saw conspiracies in every shadow, yet even she couldn't deny that there was too much coincidence here for comfort. It was just after noon when she decided to reach out to someone who might be able to give her perspective without the bias of local politics or neighborhood gossip. She called Andrew Whitman, an old friend of her late brother's who had worked in infrastructure management for the state before retiring a few years ago. Andrew wasn't the type to entertain wild theories. If anything, he had a habit of cutting through speculation with the blunt efficiency of someone who had spent decades dealing with the mechanical realities of public systems. When she explained what had happened, the redirection of the light, the strange behavior of its brightness, and the timing of the changes, he was quiet for a moment, then asked a series of precise questions about the make and model of the street lamp, the location of the nearest control box, and whether she had noticed any small devices or attachments on the fixture itself. She told him she hadn't looked closely enough to say for sure, and he suggested she take photographs of it during the day from as many angles as possible, including the wiring at its base if she could do so without stepping into the street. His voice was calm but carried an edge of concern when he said, almost offhandedly, that some municipalities had been experimenting with remote adjustable lighting systems that could alter brightness, color temperature, and beam direction from a central console, or, in some cases, from a handheld controller. It's not common, he said, and it's not supposed to be used for anything other than maintenance and emergency situations, but you'd be surprised what gets done when nobody's paying attention. That night, before the rain fully stopped, Madeline walked down the street with her phone in hand, the damp air beating on her jacket. She took the photographs as Andrew had suggested, crouching near the base to get a clear shot of the metal panel that housed the wiring. There was nothing obviously out of place, yet when she looked up at the lamp head from directly below, she noticed a small dark rectangle affixed to the underside, barely visible against the fixture's housing. It wasn't part of the standard design. She had checked similar lamps farther down the street, and none of them had it. The sight of it tightened her chest in a way she couldn't quite name. Back at home, she sent the photos to Andrew, who replied later that evening with a short message. That's an add-on. Could be a sensor, could be a wireless control unit. Either way, it's not standard issue. He didn't need to say what they were both thinking, that someone had intentionally altered the streetlight outside her home in a way that allowed for remote manipulation. It was around midnight when she saw it again, the figure passing slowly under the light, stopping as though to look at something invisible to her. This time, she didn't stay frozen at the window. She moved quietly to the kitchen where the side window gave her a view of the intersection without putting her directly in line with the light's beam. The man stood there for nearly a full minute before a car approached from the opposite direction, forcing him to move on. She couldn't make out his face, but his movements were unhurried, deliberate, the kind of pace you keep when you're surveying rather than traveling. Sleep was impossible after that, so she sat at the kitchen table with a notebook, writing down every detail she could recall, not just of that night but of the past week, times, dates, impressions, and small incidents she might otherwise forget. She was starting to think of it less as a string of inconveniences and more as a pattern that someone might one day need to see laid out in full. The following morning, she printed copies of her photographs and notes and drove them to the police station, not because she believed it would lead to immediate action, but because she wanted the information logged in a place that could not be erased. By neighborhood politics. The officer at the desk took them without comment, flipping through the pages before handing her a small card with a case number and telling her she'd be contacted if there were any developments. His expression was neutral, but she caught the faint lift of his eyebrows when he saw the close-up of the device under the lamp head. She left with no promises, yet with the quiet satisfaction that came from knowing her concerns now existed in an official record. That night the rain had stopped and the air was clear, the street washed clean and gleaming under the artificial light. She found herself sitting in the darkened living room, watching as the beam from the streetlight cut its precise angle into her yard. For nearly an hour, nothing happened. No passing figures, no pulsing changes in brightness, and she began to wonder if perhaps her presence at the police station had made someone think twice. Then, almost imperceptibly, the light shifted, narrowing slightly as if focusing. A thin shadow appeared at the far edge of her lawn, lingering just inside the hedge before retreating out of sight. She didn't move, didn't get up to chase it. She simply sat there, her hands tight around the arms of the chair, knowing that this was the quiet confirmation she had been waiting for. Whatever this was, it was targeted, it was deliberate, and it was not going to stop on its own. 2 days passed without any visible incident, and though part of Madeline wanted to believe the law was a sign that the situation was easing, the more practical part of her recognized it as nothing more than a pause before the next move. The light outside her bedroom remained in its unnatural position, unwavering in its nightly intrusion, and she could feel her patience wearing down under the steady erosion of sleep deprivation and the constant awareness of being watched. On the third morning, an envelope appeared wedged into her front door frame, unmarked and without postage, as though someone had placed it there under the assumption it would never be traced. Inside was a single sheet of paper, printed in a plain font with only one sentence. "Some things are better left alone." There was no signature, no identifying mark, and no indication of who might have sent it, but the fact that it had been delivered by hand was inescapable. Someone had walked up to her door without hesitation. Madeline did not waste time debating whether it was a threat. Its intent was clear enough. She photographed the envelope and the note, slipped both into a plastic sleeve, and placed them with the rest of her growing file before driving straight to the police station. The officer who took her statement this time looked more attentive, perhaps sensing the escalation, and promised to add it to her case file. Even so, his parting words carried the same familiar caution. Without direct evidence of who had left it, there was little they could do beyond documenting it. On the drive back, she noticed a white van parked on a side street just beyond her block. It wasn't the same dark green SUV she had seen before, but the pattern was too familiar. Parked at an angle that allowed a clear view of her house, engine off, windows closed. She resisted the urge to stop or even slow down, instead turning onto her driveway without acknowledgement. But when she looked again 20 minutes later from her kitchen window, the van was gone. That afternoon, Janet reappeared at the edge of Madeline's lawn, calling out a breezy hello and commenting on how bright and safe the street felt these days. Her tone was laced with that same faintly performative sweetness, but there was a glint in her eye that made the hair on the back of Madeline's neck stand up. She kept the exchange short, not giving Janet the satisfaction of any reaction, but she felt the pressure mounting. She was certain now that Janet knew exactly what was happening, whether or not she was the one directly responsible for it. By evening, Madeline decided she could no longer rely solely on observation and documentation. She needed deterrence, something visible enough to signal that she was not an easy target. Without advertising her plans, she contacted a local security firm that specialized in temporary surveillance setups for construction sites and event venues. Equipment designed to be obvious, with motion-triggered lights and high-mounted cameras that recorded continuously to a secure off-site server. The following day, 2 technicians arrived in an unmarked truck and, within an hour, had installed a tall, weatherproof unit at the corner of her front yard, its wide-angle lens aimed in the general direction of the streetlight and the approach to her home. It was impossible to miss, and that was precisely the point. The first night after the installation, the street was quiet. The light outside still burned into her bedroom, but there were no shadows crossing her lawn, no slow-moving figures under the lamp. It was almost enough to make her believe she had blunted whatever game was being played against her. But on the second night, at nearly 2 a.m, the camera's built-in floodlight activated without warning, triggered by movement just inside its range. From her bedroom, Madeline could see the faint spill of the light against the hedge. She stayed where she was, listening to the quiet hum of the recording system until it shut off again. The next morning, she reviewed the footage and found what she had half expected. A man in a hooded jacket, his face obscured, walking the exact curve of the hedge line before disappearing toward the base of the streetlight. He didn't touch it, at least not on camera, but he stood close enough to it for nearly 40 seconds that the implication was obvious. She sent a copy of the footage to the police and kept another for herself, knowing it might not be enough for immediate action but certain that it added weight to her file. That afternoon, she noticed the white van again, this time parked farther down and partially hidden behind a line of trees. When she glanced at it from her driveway, she saw the faint movement of someone shifting in the driver's seat. She didn't confront them, didn't give any sign she had seen them, just turned and walked back inside, every step measured, every movement deliberate. It was becoming a test of endurance, and she understood now that the person or people behind this were counting on her to lose hers. What they didn't realize was that she had no intention of backing away, not while the light still cut across her home like a silent command to submit. The shift from tension to outright confrontation came without warning, on a night that had begun in complete stillness. The air was cool but dry, the street empty in both directions, and for the first time in days Madeline thought she might actually sleep before midnight. She had just settled into bed when the light outside flickered in a way she had not seen before. 2 quick pulses, a pause, then another. It was deliberate, patterned, almost like a signal. Her first instinct was to dismiss it as a random electrical quirk, but then, from the corner of her window, she caught the faint outline of movement near the base of the pole. She remained perfectly still, letting her eyes adjust until the figure took shape, a man in dark clothing, bent slightly as he worked at something on the side of the lamp-post. The position of his hands suggested he wasn't simply inspecting it. He was either opening the panel or attaching something to it. Madeline's pulse accelerated, but her movements were calm and methodical. She reached for her phone, not to record, but to dial the police directly on the emergency line. She spoke in a low, steady voice, describing her location, the exact position of the man, and the recent incidents already logged under her case number. The dispatcher's tone sharpened instantly, assuring her that units were on their way and instructing her to remain inside. She obeyed, retreating from the window and moving to the darker side of the room, where she could still see without being seen. The man worked quickly, occasionally glancing toward the intersection as if expecting someone. Then, a faint mechanical hum carried through the quiet, followed by the light narrowing its beam until it became a piercing column that swept across her bedroom wall with surgical precision. It held there for a moment, unwavering, as if marking her in some silent declaration. The first patrol car arrived within minutes, headlights cutting across the street as it approached from the far end. The man straightened abruptly, turned, and began walking away at a casual pace that almost masked his urgency. Another car came from the opposite direction, blocking his path, and for a brief moment he froze between them. The officers moved in with practiced efficiency, one addressing him while the other kept a hand near his holster. Madeline could not hear the exchange, but the tension in the man's shoulders was visible even from her distance. When they guided him toward the curb, he resisted just enough to make one of the officers step closer, at which point something small and metallic fell from his jacket pocket onto the asphalt. It looked like a handheld device, no larger than a television remote, its casing dark and featureless except for a row of recessed buttons. One of the officers picked it up carefully, examining it under the beam of his flashlight before slipping it into an evidence bag. She stayed at the window only long enough to see the man placed in the back of the patrol car, the device secured, and the officers spending several minutes at the base of the pole, their own lights sweeping over the wiring and the small dark. Rectangle she had noticed days earlier. When they finally drove away, taking the man with them, the streetlight was left dark for the first time since this had begun. The sudden absence of its glare felt almost unreal. The street returned to a natural darkness that seemed both foreign and achingly familiar. Madeline stood there for a long moment, feeling the weight of what had just shifted. This wasn't resolution, not yet, but it was the first undeniable proof that what had been happening to her was intentional, targeted, and illegal. Whatever explanations would follow, they would have to come from those who had been caught in the act, not from whispered justifications or bureaucratic deflections. For the first time in weeks, she felt the balance tilt back in her favor. In the days that followed the arrest, the streetlight remained off, its dark silhouette a constant reminder of the weeks it had burned into her life like a watchful eye. The police contacted her twice, once to collect a formal statement and again to confirm that the device recovered from the man's jacket was capable of remotely adjusting both the beam and intensity of the light. They would not yet say who he was or why her home had been singled out, only that the investigation was ongoing and connected to similar incidents elsewhere in the county. Janet's presence became more muted during this time. She no longer appeared on her porch in the mornings, no longer called out to her in that sugary voice. On the one occasion their paths crossed, Janet's eyes slid away quickly, and for the first time Madeline saw something that looked like discomfort flicker across her face. A week later, a standard-issue replacement lamp was installed, angled toward the intersection as it had been when she first moved in. At night, the soft amber glow returned, diffused and unobtrusive, leaving her bedroom in shadow once more. She had regained the darkness she had missed, yet the peace it brought was not the same as before. The experience had altered her sense of safety, not by turning her into someone who jumped at every sound, but by sharpening her understanding that the quiet of a neighborhood could be as deceptive as it was comforting. She kept the cameras in place, not because she expected another intrusion, but because she now understood the value of being prepared without waiting for trouble to announce itself. Sometimes, in the early hours, she would stand at the window and look out at the street as it lay still under its ordinary light, thinking not of fear, but of how easily control could be taken, and how deliberately it had to be reclaimed.